The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents What Would Change Your Mind? What would change your mind is one of the most common questions I'm presented with, whether I'm in a debate or a discussion, occasionally on the TV show. It doesn't always come in the literal format of what would change your mind. But these are what the discussions are about. Somebody has one position, you don't accept it, or you accept a contradictory position, and you're trying to convince each other. And you'll present what you think should change someone's mind, and they may have a completely different standard. So asking the question, what would change your mind, is a great starting point. It's better than starting in with arguing. Present your positions and then talk about a way to find out who's right. Now, universally, the de facto answer for what would change your mind, I think, should be evidence and argument. Present a sound argument that's supported by empirical evidence that is strong and represents the facts of reality, and I will be forced by reason to accept the conclusion of that argument. In the case where I am holding a position that you think is wrong, and now we're trying to figure out what it would be that would make me change my mind, demonstrate that my reasons for believing are wrong, are mistaken, are fallacious. We'll get to more about fallacies in upcoming videos. But I used to give a pie-in-the-sky glib answer like many of my friends and acquaintances do, many of the people I've shared a stage with. What would change in our mind? Oh, well, if there was perhaps writing in the sky, which was legible to everyone, irrespective of their native language or whether they were literate at all, everyone could look up and get clearly the same message. That would be proof of God in this case, because that's primarily what we're talking about. When theists and atheists engage, it's not necessarily what would change your mind about, the origin of the universe or the date, the age of the universe. It tends to be about God at the foundation. It could be about other things as well. But when it comes to, I don't believe that a God exists, what would change my mind? That's a difficult question, because when you say evidence and argument, the natural follow-up question is, okay, you need to be more specific. What evidence would convince you? And the reason this is natural and intuitive is because this is the question we would ask for anything else. If I were to hold up this box of playing cards and say, do you believe that it has a complete deck of 52 cards in it? You might say yes, you might say no. Talk about your reasons why. But let's say you were convinced that it did in fact have 52 playing cards in it, and I asked what would change your mind, and you said evidence. Well, we're not specific. So I would say, what do you mean? Please explain what sort of evidence would change your mind? And in this case, you could say, well, we could open the box and count and make sure that there were in fact 52 cards in there, and that would confirm. But if you believed it, and I said, what would change your mind that show that you're in fact wrong? Well, the same thing. If we opened it and it was empty, if we opened it and it had 48 cards or 12 cards or peanut butter, all of those would demonstrate that your belief is wrong. This is the way we operate in the real world. Unfortunately, the God proposition and a number of other things that supposedly are part of a supernatural realm can't be addressed like this. And so when we give answers like writing in the sky or intercessory prayer, which we'll take a look at in a minute, or anything along those lines, we've made a big mistake. And so a few years ago, after dealing with the problems of these answers, I came up with what I think is a better answer, what I think may be the best answer, not because I thought of it, but because I think it covers all the ground. And that is this. I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a God. But if there is such a being as a God, then one would think that God knows exactly what would change my mind and should be capable of taking the action to present the case that would change my mind. And this hasn't happened, which means that either this God does not exist or this God doesn't want me to know that he exists yet. Either way, it's not my problem. This prevents me from, first of all, pretending that I can tell the difference between an amazing technology that I don't understand and real, honest to goodness, magic, supernatural powers. Arthur C. Clarke had pointed out years ago that a sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and that's true. If there's an event that I observe and I don't have an explanation for it, I don't get to just conclude that it's supernatural. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this particular answer today. Before I get to the third debate review of my debate with Mike Licona, where we go through the rebuttals and cross-examination, there's a number of things that we have to kind of take inventory of, including my answer to this question and the reasons behind it. So how did I get here, and what's the problem with just saying, writing in the sky? So spinning off from that Arthur C. Clarke quote, we can look at the answers that people might give. Oh, if, people prayed and things actually happened, like we were able to show a strong correlation between people praying and actual consequences. Well, I would certainly agree that you could demonstrate a correlation between a prayer and an action, but I don't know that you could demonstrate a causal link. And even if you could demonstrate a causal link between the prayer and the action, you still don't have an explanation for why their prayer works. It would just be an assumption on your part that their prayer works because what they think of as God is real and this God is answering it. You can't make that connection. I certainly understand why people would make that connection, but it's not a reasonable step. We don't get to assert what the ultimate cause is. The cause has to be demonstrated at each step in the chain. And we are blocked from being able to confirm supernatural events, supernatural causation. We can't demonstrate this. As a matter of fact, in most cases, what we're saying is we can't come up with a natural explanation, therefore a supernatural one works, which is essentially what Mike Licona argued in our debate. But if you don't have an explanation, that means you don't have an explanation. It doesn't mean you get to just say, this is the explanation, or we're so smart and we're so far along in the process of learning things that if we can't come up with a natural explanation, we're okay in saying that it is therefore supernatural until such time as we find out different. Oh, and by the way, when we say it's supernatural, what we really mean is God did it. Well, how did you reach that conclusion? Oh, well, it sounds a lot like God. Well, this happens with regard to other arguments for the existence of God as well. When people talk about an uncaused cause, even if they could demonstrate that there needed to be an uncaused cause, they can't demonstrate that it's their God. So what do they say? Oh, well, it sounds a lot like God. It might, but if the only fact you have in a murder investigation is that the killer, apparently based on the evidence, is human, and the butler is human, is that enough to conclude that the butler did it? No. And that's a case where we even know that the butler exists. What if there was a spiritual butler and we had misinterpreted something about the evidence or expanded our understanding or expanded our presumed understanding of the facts farther than was warranted by the evidence? You can't tell the difference between one thing you don't understand and another thing you don't understand. You can't show a causal connection between prayer and somebody got better. And the worst part about this is that when we actually study this, when the Templeton Foundation does studies on intercessory prayer, for example, we find it works at the rate of chance, or probably it would be better to say it doesn't work at the rate of chance. I mean, that's a little more confusing, but to say that it works gives a wrong impression as well. It's like saying, oh, this works like a charm, when charms don't work. We have no reason to think that a magical charm will do anything, and yet we keep saying, works like a charm. But if there is a God, should it actually know what would change my mind? Well, here I'm using the God of classical theism, the colloquial God that is a part of most religions. It's not a part of every religion. If there's some God that doesn't fit this mold, we'd have to talk about it in a different way. But when I say that if there is a God, it would know what it would take to change my mind, this is based on the idea that it seems absurd to call something a God if it doesn't have a basic understanding of reason and a broader understanding of reality, an understanding of reality that is so far advanced of my own that it would presumably know how to convince my mind. It would be absurd to think that it doesn't. Now, it could be the case that there is a God and he's not anywhere near all-knowing or all-powerful, doesn't know what would change my mind. But that sort of God is not the one being proposed most of the time, and it still is something that we can't demonstrate. In either case, I still don't know what it would take to change my mind. The fact that there might be a God who also doesn't know what it would take to change my mind is bizarre. But it could be the case. And yet, the facts about this God would also mean that it can't possibly intervene in reality or manifest in reality. It can't come down and visit with me, can't talk to me. So those kind of gods end up getting set to the side. Then I say, additionally, that this God should be capable of taking the actions that would change my mind. And this is based on the idea that, well, maybe God can't do absolutely anything, but certainly God can do things. And presumably, we're talking about a God that has changed other people's mind. Why is a Damascus Road experience good enough for Saul, but not for the rest of us? And I've asked that question many, many times. And I think one of the answers is that a Damascus Road experience, as described in the Bible, shouldn't be enough to convince any of us. How do you separate that from a delusion? If I'm seeing an apparition in the room, how do I know that it's a God? How do I know that it's a ghost? How do I know that it's actually an apparition, that something's not wrong with my mind? We validate this experiential information with independent observation whenever we can. And if we can't, the most we can be reasonably convinced of is that we had an experience, not that we had this particular specific experience, that it was a ghost, that it was a God. Those are things that we're glomming on as explanations when we probably don't have justification for it. And I don't know how you could demonstrate that justification. The part that I got an email about from someone, he said, if I understand your answer to people asking what would change your mind, you don't feel it necessary to give any type of response except, I don't know, not my problem. Well, that's a summary of the conclusion. And he took objection to the idea that it wasn't my problem, that it should be all of our problems to seek out and find whether or not there's a God. That kind of misses the point. I certainly agree that this is an important question that is worth exploring to a limit. How much time should be invested in something that is untestable or unfalsifiable, for something where we see no path forward? It would seem to me that it would be a much better use of our time to investigate a better understanding of reality, a better understanding of reason and epistemology, to continue to explore the sciences, to figure out what the limits are of what we know and perhaps what we can know, in order to better focus our search on whether or not there is some realm beyond ours. It's the same thing as if you were talking about, the multiverse. Well, we can't explore it. It's a hypothetical construct that is used as one seemingly plausible explanation that would help in our understandings of the origins. But anybody who says, oh, the multiverse is, I believe the multiverse, I have really good evidence for the multiverse, and it exists, it's a thing. I don't believe them. I don't see how they've connected A and B. I certainly accept that this might be one plausible explanation, but it's something we can't explore and don't know much about. When I say my answer of I don't know, it's incredibly frustrating for believers. I don't know is the answer that probably frustrates them the most. I've flat out insulted people's religions and holy books and gods, and in a way that I think is fundamentally deserved. And that was less troublesome for them than the fact that I was willing to answer I don't know. And there's a response or two that is given by believers that I want to make sure that I address here. And one is, oh, but God has in fact given you sufficient evidence. Well, that's not true because I'm not convinced. My statement is, if there is a God, it should know exactly what it would take to convince me. Not to convince you, and not even necessarily to convince a reasonable person, but what it would take to convince me. That hasn't happened. Well, the second one is, could God actually change my mind if he really wanted to? Is he powerful enough to fundamentally just make me believe? Well, you'll get a bunch of different answers. One of the more common ones is, of course, God could do that, but he won't because he doesn't want to violate your free will. Whether it's something God can't do or won't do, that doesn't mean it's the only way to change my mind. And as I've pointed out, my mind will be changed by evidence and argument. I don't know specifically what evidence, because to presume that I have the knowledge of what sort of evidence should convince me would place me in a position of having almost a godlike understanding of the universe, that I know enough to be able to tell the difference between some super advanced, perhaps alien technology and a God. Two things that I don't understand and don't have any reason to even posit as causes for something I experience. Meanwhile, we still don't have even the writing in the sky. If the writing in the sky happened, we would then begin to wonder, how exactly did this happen? Was it a technology? Was it a God? And until we find a way to differentiate those two explanations, we can't be justified in accepting either of them. And also, we need to know that those are the only two possible explanations, because if we focus on these two, we might be missing the actual explanation, which might in fact be attainable. Well, when I say that it's not my problem, what I mean is, I'm open to having my mind changed, but I'm not the one who has to convince me. Well, Jesus loves you and wants you to go to heaven. Okay, I'm happy to be convinced that you believe that. I don't know why I should believe that. Oh, well, if you reach out to God in the right way, God will reveal himself to you. This sort of answer, along with the answers from some presuppositionalists who claim, oh, well, Matt, you already know that a God exists. You don't just believe, you know. Everybody knows that a God exists. Those answers tell us nothing at all about what evidence there is for God, what reason there is to believe in a God. It doesn't tell us anything at all about what a reasonable position is, what sort of evidence should convince us. All it does is tell us that that person is convinced that they cannot be wrong. They believe in God. They know that God exists. They think that everybody knows that God exists. And so when you tell them that you don't, you must be either lying to them, lying to yourself, or somehow other, maybe God has given you over to a reprobate mind. I'm closed off, they'll say. I have closed myself off. I have a hard heart. I'm not willing to be reasonable and accept the God claim. This is another one of those positions that tells us far more about what they believe than the actual facts of the situation. I searched for God. I was a believer, and I searched for good reasons to support that belief and examined the reasons that I had and found them lacking. I didn't set out to not believe. I didn't set out to be an atheist. I didn't set out to, be an atheist advocate, evangelist, if you prefer. The idea that my heart is closed off, or that I'm unwilling to accept reasonable arguments, that's a convenient safety net for them. Because it means when they come up against somebody who disagrees, they don't have to consider the possibility that they're in error. They're just, oh, you're too stubborn, you are too stupid, you are too hard-hearted, you are too whatever, you are too committed to your sin to change your mind. But the cautionary tale in this, and I have convinced other people of my preferred answer. If somebody says, what would change your mind about God? I'm in a position where I don't believe that there's a God, so they're asking, what would it take to convince you that a God exists? And the answer is evidence and argument, and I can't give you specifics, not because of a failing within me, but because of a failing within your proposition. You've proposed something which doesn't have empirical evidence that is sufficient to warrant belief. You've proposed something which I can't really investigate. And when we have conversations about it, we get answers like appeals to faith, or emotion, or I know that I know that I know that I know that God is real, that Jesus died for my sins, that Jesus lives within me, that the Holy Spirit guides me through. I know that when I open this book and see what I see in that book, that this is God leading me towards an answer. And whenever you ask, how do you know this? Nothing is forthcoming. Now, sometimes when we're talking about a claim, what would convince you? Perhaps the answer is nothing. This might be the only response that's more frustrating than I don't know, because it really slams back against their proposition. claiming that a God exists. What would convince you that a God exists? Nothing. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's not a good answer because it doesn't explain why you think that nothing would change your mind. Quite frequently, it's the theists who are saying that nothing would change their mind. They're fans of absolute certainty. I've had apologists tell me that they are as sure that God is real and Jesus loves them and of all the other tenets of their religion as they are that their spouse exists. And there's nothing that could convince them that their spouse doesn't exist. So we can at least toss out ideas of you're in a matrix and your spouse isn't real. We can talk about things in the real world, but nothing would change their mind. On rare occasions, maybe not as rare as some would suspect, my apologist opponents, when I've asked what would change their mind, they will say evidence. Now, I will point out that this is a question that I should ask in every debate when we're in the Q&A, and sometimes I forget. Sometimes the discussion is so interesting to me, or it's different, or it's a little off, that I don't ask them what would change their mind. But that's a mistake on my part. This is something that is maybe one of the most important things that I do, and I'm going to strive to do it in every single debate. So if you're a potential debate opponent, work on your answer, because I need to ask you what would change your mind. Because if you say nothing, why are we having a conversation? All you've done is say, I'm right and I can't be wrong. And if you say evidence, and I ask, okay, can you be more specific? What evidence? The theist cannot come back with an answer that's like mine of saying, I don't know. Because they've accepted a positive proposition. They've accepted the claim that God exists. Their answer should be, can you demonstrate that my reasons are fallacious or insufficient to warrant belief? That would be one way to demonstrate that they shouldn't be convinced. The issue is that sometimes they are absolutely convinced, and so when I ask what specific evidence they would accept as something that changed their mind, in their mind they're thinking, what would disprove God? What would prove that God doesn't exist? And the question they should be asking is, what would convince me that I am wrong? Not that there isn't a God, but that my reasons for believing that a God exists are wrong. That's the path that they should be thinking on. I had one debate opponent who gave a specific. What would change his mind about his belief in Jesus? And his answer was, produce Jesus' body. Because he believes this doctrine that Jesus was real, was crucified, died, buried, and resurrected bodily to heaven. And so if you could produce a body, this would debunk, essentially, his belief. But he didn't recognize that this is about proving that his claim is false and not proving that he doesn't have a good reason to accept it. He also didn't seem to realize that this is an impossible proposition. So he's saying that the only thing that could change his mind is something that we couldn't demonstrate. Because even if there was a Jesus who lived physically and died and was resurrected and did not then bodily go to heaven and is buried somewhere with a sign that says, here lies Yeshua of Nazareth, or however the label would be appropriate for his belief and the times that we're talking about, that doesn't do anything to disprove the broader claims that he believes. And that's why when we talked about things like, how would the discovery of alien civilizations affect religion? In some cases, on a reasonable grounds, it should demolish those religions, especially if they have technological advances that seemingly produce miracles. It should destroy those things, but it won't. Because the religions that survive are the religions that are really good at adapting the specifics of their beliefs to be less specific when it comes up in conflict with the evidence. Which is why, if you ask me, are there 52 cards in that box? I can say yes, because I've examined it. Oh, but wait a minute, you looked away. Somebody might have... Okay, I'm not saying I'm absolutely certain. I'm saying that all the best evidence points to that. What would change my mind? Opening the box and finding out that there aren't. That sort of examination. This is the way we live our lives. But the supernatural is a box that we seemingly can't investigate. And if there is a God that manifests in reality in a detectable way, that is something that we should be able to investigate. But if God doesn't manifest in a detectable way, then once again, as I've pointed out before, believers are claiming to be little God detectors, detecting the undetectable. What would change my mind about that? Evidence and argument. I caution other atheists to avoid giving answers like, oh, well, if 20 Southern Baptists got together and prayed that I would levitate, and I levitated, this would then be confirmation that the Southern Baptists, the God they believed in, is real. Because it's not. It certainly would be a correlation between their prayer and you levitating, and if we were able to reproduce this over and over to show that it consistently produces these results, we would now have an identifiable phenomenon, but we wouldn't have access to the cause. Maybe the cause is the prayer itself. Maybe there's something about the human mind that when 20 people get together and focus on something intently, a natural or even perhaps a supernatural event occurs that isn't tied to any God. The God is something that people are adding into it. So on the subject of gods, and on the subject of anything else that I don't understand or seemingly can't explore, what would change my mind? Evidence and argument. And I can't give you specifics. But if there is a God, that God should know exactly what would change my mind, should be capable of doing so, and hasn't. Which means that either that God doesn't exist or doesn't want me to know he exists yet. Either way, it's not my problem. But wait a minute, Matt. This whole objection was about you saying it's not your problem. Whose problem is it? Well, at a minimum, it's God's problem. If their God exists and created a universe and gave me a brain and set up foundations of epistemology, set up foundations of scientific exploration, set up the foundations that allow me to use tools to best understand accurately the reality that I'm in, and then put his own existence as something that is untouchable by that process, that's God's problem. But whether there's a God or not, the people who are advocating that belief in God is warranted, who aren't actually able to present reasonable, evidence-based foundations, it's their problem too.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.